writing and to keep talking and blogging and making my points about that. Why don't I throw it open to you for some of your questions? And
Thank you. My questions aren't going to be about the world and politics. They're mostly going to be about you, since we have you here. The first question is something... into the mic. The first question is something that we all want to know the answer to. Will the great and powerful turtle be in the Wild Cards TV show?
We really need Melinda Snodgrass here to answer that. Yes, we have a Wild Card TV show that's under development from Universal. The script has not been written yet, so we don't know what characters are in and what characters are out. The good thing about Wild Cards is we have 1,000 characters. The bad thing about Wild Card is we have 1,000 characters, and you can't fit them all into any one thing. Ideally, I'd love it if we didn't just get one Wild Cards TV show. We got like 6 of them and had something, like they're doing with the DC universe with Flash and Supergirl and it's yada yada, or the Marvel universe with. That they're doing on Netflix with Daredevil and Jessica Jones and Luke Cage. But I don't know if they're going to go that way. But, I have this show called Game of Thrones at HBO, and HBO has signed me to what's called an overall deal, which means that HBO owns my pale white ass. And I can only work for HBO. So I cannot participate in the development of Wild Cards at Universal. That's in the hands of Melinda Snodgrass and a fellow named Gregory Novak, who is the producer attached to it. So, sadly, Melinda's not here to answer your question.
Okay, there is another series that people are interested in. What can you tell us about The Winds of Winter?
I'm working on it.
Okay, asked and answered, everybody. You're known for developing complex characters. How do you give them such depth?
That's an interesting question, and I think it relates to what I said to my earlier remarks. I think it's empathy, which for some reason I absorbed at a very early age. I always ask myself the question, well, how would it feel if that was me? When I was a kid and there was all the civil rights things going on in the 50s and 60s in the South and all that, at first when I was very young, I couldn't even understand it because, as I said, I lived, with black people in the apartment next door and up above and all that. And wait a minute, you mean there are places in the United States where I could go in and eat at a lunch counter, but Skipper and Dolores couldn't go in and eat at a lunch counter? Well, yeah, there is, And I didn't understand that. But then I went even beyond that, and I asked, well, how would I feel if that was me? And they said, you can't eat at this lunch counter. Well, I would feel bad. I wouldn't like that. And, I was not black. I didn't have the black experience, but I could empathize with that experience. And I remember reading, Andre Norton had a book called Beastmaster. I think it was Beastmaster, where it might be the wrong one, but the hero was an American Indian. And there was a lot of stuff in about it, the prejudice that he encountered as an American Indian, and the slurs and the put downs and, et cetera, et cetera. And you're reading that, and of course, Andre Norton was a white woman. Her real name was Alice Mary Norton. She was a white woman from Ohio. I don't know if she actually had any Indian blood or if she knew any Indians or anything like that. But up to that point in my life, the only Indians I'd encountered were on television and films, where they were always the enemy who came whooping over the horizon to kill everybody in the wagon train. But that Andre Norton book put me inside the head of an American Indian, and the magic of empathy took place. And while I was reading that book, I was, I think Hosteen was his name, Hosteen Storm or something like that. I was him. I was experiencing life as him, and I was feeling the injustice of what was being done to him. And I've always tried to keep those things in mind. And when I write, from the viewpoint of a woman, obviously I haven't had those experiences. I've known people who have, but I always try to think, well, how would I feel if I was a woman and this was happening? And I'd want to make my reader feel that. When I'm writing from the viewpoint of a dwarf, obviously, I'm not a dwarf, but I can empathize with how would I feel with all of that. So I think empathy is always the key to creating any sort of character. Even villains. I mean, someone was talking on this last panel, and I came at the end about you have to have fully fleshed characters, even the villains. Yes. I mean, the Red Skull exists only in comic books and was not one of the greatest heroes anyway. Villains anyway. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, "Ha, what evil can I do today?" Everybody thinks there's a reason for what they do. Everybody is the hero of their own story. So even when I'm writing from the viewpoint of someone who's maybe not the nicest person in the world, like in my book, somebody like Victorian Greyjoy or Theon Greyjoy, they think they're justified in what they're doing. They have rationales, they have excuses. They may even think they're doing the moral thing by whatever lights that they've been taught are morality. And I have to get inside their skin for the time that I'm writing from their viewpoint and seeing through their eyes.
Okay. You've made New Mexico your home for a long time. I heard that when you first moved to New Mexico, you were involved in the New Mexico Mafia. What was your involvement with them?
Well, I was the hitman, of course. Whenever they needed someone whacked, they called me. No, there was no moment like that. Was just the group of writers. New Mexico has a lot of writers. I don't know how we compare to you guys in Arizona, but I think we have more. None of them were born there, of course. Everybody kind of moved there. Well, Melinda was sort of born there, and maybe Vic Milan. But people like Roger Zelazny and me and Fred Saberhagen and many other writers were born in various other parts of the world, and then at some point discovered New Mexico. Ate some green chili, and then we became addicted, and we had no choice but to move down there so we could get our regular supply of green chili.
Can you tell us a quick story about how they actually came up with the name?
Of New Mexico Mafia?
Yes.
I didn't come up with it. I don't know.
Okay.
There was a lot of mafias in those days. The Milford Mafia was actually, when Damon Knight founded the Milford Writers Conference, he had a group of writers that he invited every year to Milford to critique each other's stories. Damon, I'm not sure how many of you remember Damon or know who he is. One, I guess. Damon was an immensely influential figure in the history of science fiction. He was a writer, but it's not as a writer that he was really so influential. It was really for the other stuff he did. I mean, he founded the National Fantasy Fan Federation. He founded the Science Fiction Writers of America. He founded the Milford Writers Conference. He helped found the Clarion workshops. He was always going around founding things. And Damon was a proselytizer. He had this view that we had to break down the walls of the science fiction ghetto, and science fiction had to mature and become more literary. He was one of the first great critics in the field. Before Damon, there was science fiction writers, when they reviewed each other, it was like all praise. There was sort of an unspoken thing. Well, we're all in this together, and we have to help each other, and it was the thumper rule. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Damon was not Thumper. He came in there and said, no, we're only going to get better if we show what's wrong with these things. And he ripped books apart and flayed them in the early 50s, and including some giants of the field like A. Van Vogt. I mean, A. Van Vogt was never the same when Damon got through with him. But anyway, one of the things he founded was this Milford Writers Conference, where he invited particularly some established writers, also some young writers, to get together and criticize with this idea in mind that we had to become better, we had to become more literary, we had to do that. And there were certain other writers in the field, primarily older writers and more conservative writers, who didn't like this, and it became more heated when the old wave, new wave war began, which again, I don't know how many of you remember that, but the late 60s, early 70s, there was a movement called the New Wave in science fiction, and then there were the older writers who didn't like that, and they were the old wave, and there was a big fights about it. And also Damon founded SFWA and Nebula Awards, and a lot of the Nebula Awards went to writers who went to Milford, and who taught at Clarion, and who were associated with the New Wave and published in Damon's anthology Orbit. So the old wave writers, the people who weren't part of that, started deriding Damon and his group who went to Milford as the Milford Mafia. So it was actually the enemies of Damon and Milford who coined the term Milford Mafia. But Damon just laughed and took it happily and started calling themselves that. So we've had these fights and feuds in science fiction, they go all the way back. Admittedly, the present one, which with the puppies, is probably the ugliest and nastiest and worst we've seen. But it's not the first by any means. I mean, you can go back to the Futurians and the Exclusion Act and the old wave and the new wave and all of this stuff. And we may be a family, but we're kind of a quarrelsome family. Where there's always a crazy uncle that you got to deal with. Yes.
One last question before we have questions for the audience. You have been characterized in a lot of memes. Do you have any favorites?
What? Give me that one again.
You've been characterized in a lot of memes.
Yes.
Do you have any favorites, or would you just like to continue on?
No, I don't. I read on a DOS machine with WordStar 4.0. I don't get into that whole meme thing. I know I have a presence on Twitter and Facebook, but that's really my minions. I blog. That's about as advanced as I get, and then people pick it up and run with it. So.
Okay.
All right, we have a microphone in the middle, so come up to the microphone if you have a question, and I'll do the best to answer that. Hello.
What was your inspiration for creating the Society of Faceless Men, and was there anything in history that inspired it, or was it just a plot thing with Arya that you thought about, or what was your original inspiration?
My original inspiration for creating the Faceless Men, I don't know. It's a common trope of fantasy that you have like the Guild of Assassins. I was hardly the first one to invent the Guild of Assassins. That's largely a fantasy trope. There's not much evidence for that in history. Well, the one evidence is you did actually have a group called the Assassins who were in the Middle East, and there was a guy called the Old Man of the Mountain who would send forth his assassins to kill people in the Middle East, where they've been killing people for many, many centuries. But they were not like fantasy guilds of assassins. So I decided to put my own spin on it. I actually came up with several different guilds of assassins, not only the Faceless Men, but the Sorrowful Men and all that. And there's a little bit in there in the philosophy of the Faceless Men. Is they're in some senses they're a death cult, and it's a religious basis, which I kind of thought about and extrapolated from that. I'm surprised we don't have more death cults in the real world. because it just seems to me that if you're going to worship something, death is a pretty good thing, because, you know, like, we have all these religions that promise you life everlasting. None of them ever deliver on it. Everybody in all the other religions that promise you worth dies anyway. So the death cult is the one that wins, you know? The death cult can really deliver death. It's like, come and worship with us and you will die. Well, yeah, you probably will. So, what the hell? So I took with that and ran with it. Yeah.
Hi there. I just wanted to
Is
ask...
that Westeros on your dress?
Yes, it is, of course. I just wanted to ask, I know you have quite a lot of Dunk and Egg series books planned. Are we ever going to see Tansel Tootal again? Are we going to find out what happens to her?
Well, that would be telling. But I think there's a good chance, yes.
Yay.
Hi. So, whenever I first read your series, I of course sided with Daenerys since she has the land originally. But I'm a history teacher and I'm teaching my students about the westward expansion. And as I'm teaching them about how the American citizens took over the land, I'm siding with us because we were able to use brute force. And if whoever wins the land is the original ownership. So my question is it, with your opinion, not trying to get your opinion on how the story will end, but even with that and historically, is it the person who dominates it and with brute force, or is it the people who originally founded the land have ownership?
Well, you know, human beings through all of history have been trying to sort this out, who has the right to the land. I mean, how far back do land claims go? You know, you go far enough back and all the lands were Neanderthal man, and, you know, then he gets wiped out by Cro-Magnon, and, or interbreeds with Cro-Magnon. Theories have now diverged on that point. And then civilizations come and go. I mean, you look at the British Isles, and, you know, in historical terms, you had the Picts and the Scots there originally, and the Celts. You might even have older groups than that if you believe the legends that Tuatha De Danann and the Firbolg were based on actual peoples who existed there before the Celts came. But then after the Celts, you know, the Romans come in and they have their thing and they leave their deposits, and then after the Romans you get the Angles and the Saxons, and after the Angles and the Saxons you get the Normans. The Vikings come in, the Danes, they have a influence, they get a few kings. So history is written in blood, and the land doesn't belong to anyone except who takes it and what they do with the preceding inhabitants. If there's one thing history has taught us, it's that. I would like to think that Gordy Dixon was right, and that a moral evolution is gone, and that you know, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, we will arrive at the point where history is no longer written in blood, but is you know, written in ink or phosphors on a computer screen again, and where we are all Terrans, and, you know, some of us maybe. Well, you look at these DNA tests on Ancestry.com, I think we're all mongrels anyway. We just sometimes don't like to admit it to each other.
Did you say mongrels or mongrels?
Mongrels. Mutts. We're mutts. The human race is mutts, and we need to become more mutts. All these, you know, cries to France for the French, Germans for the Germans, America for the Americans. All of these are throwbacks, atavistic, xenophobic things, fear of the other, fear of differences, and hopefully eventually we'll leave this all behind. And I think we will eventually, because the more people live together, the more they fuck with each other, and children are born, and all the interbreeding occurs, whether we pass laws against it or horrified by it, and the cultural traditions happen, and people move into your neighborhoods and found a new restaurant, and you discover you like that food, and you meet the owners, and their children go to school with your children, and it's all, everything comes together, all these things, and I think that's the future there. Even in Westeros, of course, I've tried to indicate a sort of British history with the Westeros. I mean, you have the children of the forest first, and they're the only people there, and they really are a distinct species, and the giants, who are another distinct species, and then human beings come in, the first men, and of course, it's written in blood, so there's a lot of war, they kill each other, they form a treaty, but then here comes another invasion with the Andals coming in, and eventually the Targaryens arrive with their dragons, and having a dragon really helps things. So, thank you. Hello.
Hello. All right. As you probably know, a lot of writers reflect themselves in their characters or put certain aspects of their character. And I'm wondering, what character in Game of Thrones did you most put yourself into? Which one most personified you?
Tyrion.
I knew it!
I am, however, taller. And, those quips that Tyrion tosses off at a moment's notice take me weeks to come up with. I'm one of these guys, I could have said something really witty there. I think of it 3 weeks later.
Hi, I'm a huge fan of Haviland Tuff.
Ah,
And I noticed, it seems like a lot of the stories are very clearly pointing at different society issues, and I wondered if you're going to do any more of them. That's it. We're going to see more of him.
I have ideas for another 20 tough stories, but I'm kind of busy with the Ice and Fire thing right now, so I don't know when I'll get around to writing them. At some point, sure. I even had at one point a contract for a second tough book. The first collection was called Tough Voyaging, and the next one was going to be called Twice as Tough.
I would get that.
But I never wrote the stories, and I got involved in this other stuff, and I eventually bought out the contract by paying the publisher back. But someday I'd love to do that. He was a fun character to write, and those stories were kind of fun. They're a little lighter than most of my stuff. Well, they're not really a romp. There are like entire worlds that are destroyed and stuff. But it's interesting what's considered light entertainment and what's not considered light entertainment. I've thought about that. Sometimes, you kill one character that the people know and love, and you get this reputation for being bloody. But you wipe out millions of people and no one blinks, It's like we look at Schindler's List as, this incredibly dark and gripping film about the Holocaust, and, we see people die, who are killed, who are shot and all that. And we consider Star Wars a light romp, but like in Star Wars, they blow up the entire planet of Alderaan. Like, before the story, I just felt a great disturbance in the forest, 50 billion people have just been snuffed out. And what's the next act? Okay. So it's odd the way, one death is a tragedy and 50 billion deaths are a statistic, as I think someone once said.
Maybe more of the immediacy.
So there are horrible things that happen in tough stories, but they're in the realm of statistics. So
Thanks very much.
thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
I've been an independent author for about 6 years. Big fan of your work.
Thank you.
Down, as you can tell. I follow your blog as well. You're not a blog, and I just wanted to know if you I can see that you're an ally to some indie authors. Do you have any advice? Because there's a persona there between the traditionally published authors and the indie authors. What's your take on that? Do you have any advice for up and coming authors in the sci-fi world?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think first of all, I'm not an expert on independent publishing.
Right.
I've never done it myself.
Mhm.
I'm, what you would call a traditionally
Yes.
published author. I do think that independent publishing is probably the wave of the future. We see the traditional publishers struggling in some sense. There's fewer and fewer of them. They tend to merge. The big six of a few years ago are now the big five, and of course they used to be the big 20, or the big 10, and the medium-sized 30, and the slightly smaller 57. But on the other hand, there's a lot of things that have to be sorted out about independent publishing. I mean, before there was independent publishing, there was something called vanity publishing, where you paid to have your own book published. And of course, there were occasional success stories with vanity publishing, which the vanity publishers would always trumpet. Oh, here's a guy who published with us and he became a bestseller. But for every one like that, there were 10,000 people who published with a vanity publisher, and they got 5,000 copies of their book, which are still in their garage, because there was no distribution, there was no support. And indeed, most of the books belonged in someone's garage because they were terrible. There were no gatekeepers. Traditional publishing has a series of gatekeepers where, the stuff that's really bad gets rejected. There are no gatekeepers with independent publishing, which means undoubtedly there are some good books being published independently. There's also a tremendous amount of crap. Some of it is like semi-crap, and some of it is like totally crap. And I know people want to write, they want to express their opinions, they want to get their dreams out, but sometimes it's sad. I mean, I go to conventions and I see people sitting with a table in the dealer's room with piles of their independently published book in front of them, desperately trying to sell a copy to anyone who goes by, and people are sort of hurrying by and not making eye contact because then they'd feel obliged to purchase the book. But I also see successes, and there's certainly Hugh Howey, was a great success with that, and certainly the distribution is low. And I know friends of mine who are established authors, Walter John Williams, for example, has recently put all of his backlist book on available as independent publications. And he told me recently he's making like $40,000 a year from it. Well, that's pretty damn good for a bunch of backlist books. And if it keeps up year after year. But what's important in his case is he established himself first as a writer published by traditional channels. And he's still doing his new books in traditional publications. So those are the locomotives that are driving the train, and then his old backlist books are being pulled along with the train. So it's a whole new game. I mean, I don't know the rules of this game to advise you. I know the rules of my game, and some people win and some people lose. And you can lose for a long time and then win. I mean, my career has bottomed out at least twice where I thought I would be selling real estate. But I kept at it. I mean, you have to keep, when you have a game where some people win and some people lose, the important thing is to keep playing, because you can't win if you don't play. And that may be true for independent publishing too, but when everybody is independently publishing, how are you going to know which books are good and which books are not good? How are you going to get the word out there about your books? How are people going to know what to review? I mean, there's so much of it. It's a whole different game, and I don't know, but
Well, thank you.
good luck with it.
Thank you.
Let me ask you a question though. Did you choose independent publishing because you preferred it to traditional publishing, or did you try traditional publishing, get nowhere, and then turn to independent?
I did not. I did like 3 weeks of research. I didn't sleep for hours. I couldn't decide. And I never even submitted to an agent. I said, indie is my way. You make 70% of your profits, and as opposed to possibly 3% traditionally published. I mean, it just depends. I mean, unless you're you or Stephen King. There was a lot of factors. You get to control how you get edited and just the whole process.
Well, you do have control,
It's a lot faster
but
as well.
on the other hand, you have to do all these other jobs, like your own copy editing and your own editing, and you have to get the cover yourself, and yada, all of that stuff.
Right.
Promotion and publicity. With traditional publishing, you have other people doing those things for you who are maybe better at these
Yes,
things than you are.
absolutely.
So
It was just a choice I made, and I just heard a lot of hybrids. A lot of indie publishers or indie authors get picked up from the big six or the big
Right.
five because they do so well on Amazon. And it's just a hope of mine. We'll see.
all right, well,
Eventually.
good luck with it.
Thank you.
This is going to have to be the last question, so thank you very much.
Hi, as a fellow avid reader, I was wondering who some of your favorite characters you've read over the years in particularly fantasy literature, but literature in general. Who stands out to you?
My favorite characters,
Yes.
not writers.
No, characters.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Of course, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, and so, the characters from there, Frodo and Sam and Gandalf and Aragorn and Boromir. I always like gray characters, so I have a thing for Boromir. Poor brave Boromir. Got arrows in him. I read like mysteries, detective fiction as well. Big fan of the Travis McGee books by John Day MacDonald. One of my favorite characters, Travis and his wounded birds. And of course, I read mainstream literature. The Great Gatsby is one of my all-time great books ever written, and I reread that one every few years. In science fiction fantasy, I mentioned Poul Anderson earlier. He had a character called Nicholas Van Ryn that I love. There were a whole series of books about him. The first one was called The Man Who Counts, although when it was published, it was serialized in analog, astounding back then, as The Man Who Counts. When it was published as a novel, they changed it to War of the Wingmen. But it's still a terrific book, and the first one to feature that character who came back many times. Who else do I like? I'm sorry, I'm getting away from science fiction and fantasy. Flashman. George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman books, historical adventures about, and that's interesting because Flashman was originally introduced in Tom Brown's School Days about a Victorian kid who went to a boarding school at, where was Eton or something like that, and Tom Brown, and where he was bullied unmercifully by this cad called Flashman, and that became a classic of Victorian literature and the basis of several mini-series on PBS and all that. But George MacDonald Fraser said, well, what happened to this Flashman guy after he was expelled for drunkenness from the school? And he wrote this whole series of marvelous adventures about how Flashman enters the army. And he remains a bully, a cad, a lech, a liar, a scoundrel, but a very charming one. And he's involved in every war of the 18th and 19th centuries, usually ends up running away with his tail between his legs, and yet gets acclaimed a hero and gets another medal and a promotion at the end of it. And the books are just a delight, and also a rich source of historical truth. You learn things about history you never learned before. So I know we're out of time. I could go on for another hour, but I love to read. I love characters here. So anyway, thank you all for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. But I will be around. I'll be, sitting by a pool. I'll be in the con suite and things like that. So feel free to talk to me. I don't bite usually. And enjoy the con. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. And feel free to enjoy our other shows, such as D&D Journey of the 5th Edition and Scion Ragnarok and Roll, a Scion hero to Ragnarok story. Thank you for listening.